Hello, welcome to the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Rich Binger. I'm from the University of York, and I'm going to be one of the speakers in this session. We're going to talk about how statistics is being used in sports, how to study sports and how to research sports. We're going to hear a little bit about the research that we do in this area at the University of York. But first, before we start, I've got to do some housekeeping. That is, in the unlikely event of emergency, we should follow the steward's instructions and evacuate by the closest exit. I assume this is our steward at the front. Please can I also ask you to put your phones on silent. Right, as I said, we're going to talk about statistics in sport. The people who do that here are from the Quantitative Sports Analysis Group. We call it QSA. We don't pronounce the colon. The people from the Quantitative Sports Analysis Group are Jess, Ben, and myself. We're all based in the Department of Mathematics here at York. Unfortunately, Ben can't make it today. So Jess and I are going to talk a bit about how statistics has been used in the past in sports, but then we're going to hear about the future of analysis of sports from a couple of our PhD students, Tara and India. And we also have Lexi, who couldn't be here today, but she's an undergraduate student, but she has done huge amounts of work in this group, so we're really indebted to her as well. Right, so I think most people would be familiar with the idea that statistics and sports go hand in hand. We kind of know at the end of the year we look at a table being a recorded value of stats. You know, Premier League table is a recording of how good the football teams were. So the idea of sports generating statistics is very, very familiar to us. But whether it's time, points, or goals, we use those statistics in order as an idea to objectively decide the winner of those sporting contests. That's the idea of the sport. That's kind of one of the reasons we like it, is this idea of objectivity. In terms of analysis, though, we can talk about the goals, deciding the winner, but obviously in a football match there can be many tackles, crosses, interceptions, passes, but only a few goals. Goals are the rare event in those games. So we need to understand the game of football better, for example, how those rare events can be caused by more frequent events. As you saw on that video at the start, the theme of the Festival of Ideas is called Making Waves. And I'm going to talk first about what was really the first wave in football statistics. And that was defined by a man called Charles Reap, who you may have heard of, who is kind of known as the father of football statistics. He's also known as Wing Commander Charles Reap. He apparently liked to be called Wing Commander because he was an RAF accountant for many, many years. But he was football mad, obviously. We wouldn't go into this without it. But his pivotal moment in football was in the 1930s. He attended a series of lectures about the tactics developed by Herbert Chapman, who was the Arsenal coach at the time, and he was kind of revolutionary in developing the way football is played in this country. He used those tactics that he developed. He developed it into a method that he called loose balls in the goal mouth. As we can imagine, not very refined football, but this was very successful in the RAF teams that he managed. At all the bases he went and managed the RAF teams, and these all did very, very well. The story goes that in 1950, he was watching a game between Swindon Town and Bristol Rovers, and at half-time, he was so frustrated with Swindon playing slowly and not attacking well that he decided to start recording how they were attacking and where it was going wrong. And he developed this shorthand notational analysis method, and this is the method that we still use today in football analysis. We just now have the benefit of all of the technology that is developed. But basically it's splitting the game into events. So in Reap's method, he split the pitch into sections, said what's happening between which sections, which passes are going where, which ones are successful, which ones are not, how we're creating goals in that game. So he took this method of recording the games, and the story further goes on that in 1951, Brentford were in danger of relegation from the First Division with a 31% win percentage, and the coach of Brentford, manager at Brentford at the time, heard about from one of his scouts a team down the road that had just won 12-1, and they had a guy running about on the sidelines with all these scraps of paper. So he went to see this bloke with the scraps of paper, turned the 31% win percentage into a 69% win percentage for their final 12 games of the season, helped them avoid relegation, and that was kind of Reap's first step into the professional game of sports. He worked in the 50s very successfully with Stan Cullis from Wolves, who in 1954, they won the First Division title, They also had a great degree of success through that time. Stan Cullis was the sort of manager who liked this idea of effective football, and this was kind of Reap's first real big success in the game. He worked with a load of clubs through the 60s, 70s and 80s even, but none quite as prominently as working with Wolves. Over the course of his career, he annotated apparently around 2,000 matches in total, but he also published articles in the press that were discussing the game as it went at the time, and he wasn't always very complimentary around the European developments in football of the Hungarian team of the 1950s, were a very tactical team, and also he didn't really like total football from the 70s and 80s. He liked to focus on this idea of effective football. So he developed this notational analysis system. This is an example of one here from the 1952, I think, 1953 FA Cup final, the Matthews final between Blackpool and Bolton. He took this shorthand, which is what you can see, these notes are down the right-hand side of the page. These are shorthand annotations of the game. This is what he would do in live play, apparently sometimes wearing a miner's helmet with a piece of paper that was 2 foot wide or something, going through it, just churning through this analysis, that in theory was an objective record of the game. At the time, obviously, he had to do this live. There were so few games that were recorded in a way you could go back over that footage like we can do nowadays. So he had to do this live during the game, which then meant he had to do the analysis after the games. And apparently one game took him about 80 hours after to turn it into something more advanced. This is an example of something more advanced that he would produce from the games. I'm not sure if anybody recognised it straight off the bat, but this is from a rather famous England game. This is an analysis of the crossing from the 1966 World Cup final. I can't tell what's going on there either, so I'm not worried about that. But this is one of the issues with Reap was that he actually never showed anybody else his shorthand method. He refused to share it too much with anybody else because he kind of wanted to be fully in control of it. Other people developed their own method for the same idea, but he was the person who kind of worked on it first and worked on it very deeply over the years. So it wasn't just this kind of notational method of recording events in games, looking at percentages. He also did some more thorough statistical analysis, and this was one of the papers he published is this paper, Skill and Chance in Association Football, from 1968. So quite a bit later. He's actually working on this paper with the person who was the chair of the Royal Statistical Society at the time, Benjamin. So you can maybe you can see, probably can't hear, but he's got a record of all the games he's attended basically from 52 through to 67, and the number of games he's watched in those seasons, and recording the statistics from those. So what he found was, on average, during this time, this is the column you can see here, 10 shots are needed for every goal scored. That was one of his key insights. So basically, have more shots, score more goals. That kind of is an obvious thing to take away. The kind of more insightful thing, and this is the real point that was his legacy, I think, in some ways, is that 80% of the goals come from moves of only 3 completed passes or less. So you're more like, in this idea, you're more likely to score having fewer passes. And that's kind of the legacy of what he did, is you don't need to do passes in order to score a goal. Most goals come from short-term events. So we had this 3-pass move. This is what he calls, if you can also see, he talks about R-pass moves. It's in small writing there. But then he looks at the total number of R-pass moves, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, number of those moves with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 passes or less. And he finds that this fits a negative binomial distribution. So he did a few things that fit this distribution. You may be familiar with the binomial distribution from your school days. It's about coin tosses, normally is how we cover it, success or failure. The negative binomial distribution focuses mainly on the failures, and it's to do with a sequence. So it works for passes because it's kind of like the more passes you do, the more chance one will go wrong. Distribution would look something like this. This is just one approximation I've come up with. So basically, more things with fewer events, very few things with long events. It's what we call a long tail distribution as well. It goes on a long way, so it has a long carry on through. So he also found from this work that roughly 91.5% of the passing sequences have 3 completed passes or less. So this point combined with the second one is what people often talk about as Reap's fallacy. So it's the idea that if it was the 3-pass moves that were the most important thing, you would see more than 80% of goals. You would see more like 91% of goals from it if it was the 3 pass moves that were leading to the goals. So those 2 points were the points that kind of undermined his analysis in some ways. We can see that the 3 pass moves aren't always leading to goals. He developed from this idea about talking about what he called reaches and pitches. This is just long balls, getting the long balls into the box, getting them into the dangerous areas, creating the loose ball in the goal mouth, doing that as often as possible, and his methods were often based upon the idea of you need 10 more of these long balls up into the box to score those goals. So his methods often developed, his coaching method often worked along these lines. So this was his main idea of fewer passes are needed to score. So this idea was popular in the 50s, but then really took off, found some receptive audiences in the late 70s and 80s. And partly it was because what Reep talked about was, he often mentioned this idea of being wholly English style of play. This in the 30s it was called kick and rush, in the 70s and 80s became known as the long ball game. So it found some receptive audiences. He worked with Graham Taylor at Watford from around 1980 onwards. Watford won the FA Cup in 84, I think, and they were First Division runners-up. Maybe not 84, but around that time. Right. So they won, but they also Division 1 runners-up at some point in the early 80s. So Graham Taylor was a big fan of his ideas. As you can see from this quote from Graham Taylor, he wasn't such a fan of playing the ball around and looking after it. He liked to chuck the ball up into that attacking third, away from your defensive area, into the attacking area, and this was a Reep idea as well. Kind of more consequential person, not to say Graham Taylor wasn't consequential, but more consequential person who took this idea up was Charles Hughes, who you may have heard of, but he was the FA Director of Coaching in the 80s and 90s. He kind of codified the idea of loose balls in the goal mouth into position of maximum opportunity, or POMO, and the idea was getting those balls into the POMO as quickly as possible and as often as possible, leading to goals. And he wrote coaching manuals which were very influential. These are often taken up by academies through the league, and anybody who's coaching who's trying to get people into the FA structure would have to learn this kind of method. Famously, I think this book has something like 20 pages on long ball passing and about 5 pages on skillful runs, so there's a kind of bias towards that idea. So this long ball game has sort of a long-term consequence, kind of a long tail of Reep's work, like the negative binomial, and biasing towards bigger players to play that game. So Graham Taylor, Carlton Palmer, Tony Adams, these sort of players can help defend against those long balls. Forwards like Andy Carroll, Alan Smith can help attack those long balls because they're the larger players. So we tend to bias by trying to play a certain way towards a certain type of player. And one of the consequences of this Reep-influenced long ball game being suited to the big players, is that even in 2009, so even as late as this, 57% of the boys at Premier League academies are born between September and December. That's the final quarter of the year. It's referred to as quarter 4. And this, as you probably know, they're going to be the biggest kids in the school year. So when you're separated into playing football groups based on your school years, these kids are more likely to be bigger. So they're more likely to thrive at this type of physical game. So this 57% of boys, it's part of a well-known effect called the relative age effect. This is seen in lots and lots of sports, basically picking the people who are largest in their age group. But it does have a slight downside. And that is if you look across the elite game, so that is now England level games, so the England players with 50 plus caps, these are the top of the game, they were actually 46% of them were born between March and May, so that's the second quarter of the year. So this relative age effect doesn't necessarily select for the most effective players. The top level of the game will be a bit more unbiased, and in some ways, possibly the rationale is biased towards people who aren't the biggest in their year because they've had to work out a different way to play the game. As an example of that, the average Ballon d'Or winner is 5'10". So you think of Messi, Xavi, Cannavaro in Italy, these sort of skillful players have had to think of a different way to play the game. So it has a consequence for the elite game having this large number of players who are selected based upon their size at an early age. And this is backed up by research as well. So this is research from university in Croatia, I think. about the relative age effect across 5 different countries. The top 2 tiers are 5 different countries, so Germany, France, Italy, England and Spain. There's a lot of numbers there, but what I would say is that we see that the England leagues, both the top 2 leagues, have both got the lowest chi-squared, which in this case is going to be a measure of how skewed, how out of line that distribution is with a normal even distribution of kids across the year. So basically, how much is this relative age effect having an effect? And we see that we're most likely to have these relative age effects in this country. And just as another example of a stat that can have a consequence, this is the major international competitions of the last 25 years. You'll see there's none in our column. So the point that I'm trying to say, oh, we can't quite see the bottom here, but is that this simple statistical idea of the 80% of players having 80% of goals coming from 3-pass moves has possibly had this big consequence leading to our game being a bit out of touch with the way it is played in the rest of the world. So this is an example of the first wave of statistical analysis in sport. We're now going to hear about an ongoing wave, possibly ongoing wave, in a different sport where it's been a bit more successful.
Thank you. Right, so yeah, like Rich has been saying, the theme of the festival this year is making waves, and our talk is about people who've made waves in terms of statistics in sport. And I think perhaps the most famous example of that is Moneyball. So to see if I'm right in saying the most famous example of that, put your hand up if you've ever heard of that word phrase, Moneyball. Okay? Keep your hand up if you've seen the film with Brad Pitt called Moneyball. Okay? Less of us. Keep your hand up if you've read the entire book called Moneyball. Okay, well, don't worry. Thank you very much. We're in good company. But don't worry if you'd never put your hand up at all, because that's my aim, to try and distill those films, books and things into the next 10 minutes. That's my primary aim. My secondary aim is to use this talk as a vehicle to display photos from my honeymoon. There's already been a photo from my honeymoon in this presentation, so I'll give you a moment to think about where in the presentation so far you might have seen a photo of a honeymoon. And while you're doing that, I'll just reiterate, because I've got family members in, I've got in-laws in, so the honeymoon was in no way designed around hitting the most famous ballparks in America. No way. It was just total coincidence. Anyway, so while we're doing a bit of audience participation, let's get the sense of the crowd, how into baseball we are. So put your hand up if you've ever seen a baseball game being played. Ah, right, excellent. Yeah, fantastic. Okay. Put your hand up if you've ever played a game of baseball. Okay. Excellent. Put your hand up if you've played a game of rounders. Excellent, fantastic. So it's very similar to rounders. I'm just going to give you, there's a lot of rules, as you can imagine, but I'll give you the ones that are important for us today. So it's a lot like rounders. We've got a batting team and a fielding team. And, okay, so the pitcher, it's called in baseball, is going to throw the ball at the batter who's going to try and hit it. And they try and run around the bases, get back to where they started. And if they do, they score a point. So that sounds very familiar, that's very like rounders, but the key difference for us today is that unlike rounders, you don't have to get back to the start on your turn. So if I hit the ball and I make it to first base, and then my teammate comes along, hits the ball, and at some point, if before the three of us get out, if I get back home, I will score a point. So it's slightly different, you don't have to do it all in one go. Couple of other rules that we need to know today. So we all kind of know the phrase 3 strikes and you're out. So the batter kind of gets 3 chances to try and hit this ball that's coming at them at 100 miles an hour. And another rule of 3, like we say, 3 out, all out. So on our team, when our team's batting, when 3 of us are out, that's the end of our go. We let the other team have a bat. And finally, a bit like rounders, if the pitcher throws a ball that's judged a no ball, so a not very good, unhittable ball. Yep, that's called a ball, and if I have 4 of those on my go, I get to just walk to first base. Okay? Right, happy with the rules of baseball then? We're all baseball experts. Excellent. So let me take you back to the year 2001. Possibly one of the most famous teams in baseball, in sport, definitely one of the richest sports teams in the world, is the New York Yankees. And in 2001, the budget that they have for their salary was $114 million. Now, the heroes of our story, the Oakland Athletics, which you may or may not have heard of, what we call a small market team, so lesser known team, their salary budget is $40 million, so still a lot of money, but around a third of what the New York Yankees are paying their players. So you'd imagine then, if you've got teams that are paying kind of triple what we're paying them, they're going to hoover up all the best talent. So all the best players are going to play for the Yankees, getting paid all the big bucks, and we'll have, what's left. So if they've got all the best players, they're likely to win all the games, right? So let's have a look in 2001 in the regular season. So it's America, there's a playoff structure. In the regular season, the Yankees are winning 59% of their games. Very good record. They did very well that year, winning more than they're losing. And our Oakland Athletics have got a win percentage of 63%. So not only are they not getting trounced every week by people getting paid 3 times as much of them, they're doing very well, they're holding their own. And in fact, they did so well, they went through into the playoffs where they met the New York Yankees. And unfortunately, in 2001, they lost to the New York Yankees at that stage. So everybody in the Oakland Athletics team was very disappointed. But I would argue that that is a fantastic achievement, to be doing so well in the regular season, to be competing, getting through to the playoffs on a budget a third of your opposition is very good. So how are they doing it? Well, what we need to do then, if we've got a lower budget, is try and find the players that no one else values. So try and find people out there that aren't being spotted as the traditionally good baseball player, okay? So how are we going to do that? Well, at the end of the, let's say, 2001 season, because it wasn't just us that think, the Oakland Athletics are doing pretty well, other teams thought it as well. So, like I say, at the end of the season, they take our top 3 players. So now we have to think about bringing the new players in, and what are we going to do? So here we go. This is where we start with Moneyball. So this is a book that came out in 2003. So it's talking about this 2002 season. And most of the stuff, like I say, that's going to follow this is based on that book. So just giving credit where it's due. Right, so traditionally, we're going to call it scouting theory today. Well, the traditional approach in baseball, and it still happens today, is that scouts go out into the real world and watch people play baseball. And then they've got to try and base decisions about whether this is a good baseball player they want to bring to their team. So traditionally, the scouts are basing their decisions on the 5 tools. Okay, so this is what they think makes a good baseball player: speed, quickness, arm strength, hitting ability, and mental toughness. They give a mark for each tool, because I'm going to need to have some way of recording what I think about these players when I go back to the team and feed that back. And so they give a mark out of 5. A mark of 5 means that's major league level. That's interesting. And then this hitting ability, one of the main things that they're doing is thinking about something called batting average, which we'll look at in a bit more detail a bit later. So, just like we've seen in Richard's talk, the traditional scouts are using statistics. Yeah? What are they doing? They're trying to look at somebody playing sport. They're trying to quantify in some way what makes a good baseball player. They need some way of recording that and communicating that to the rest of the team. So there's already the use of statistics in baseball in 2001. So what is the Moneyball secret then? What are they doing different? Well, they need to find the undervalued players. They want to use alternative statistics that no one else is using that they think might be better indicators of good baseball players. So they look at, again, this is a statistic that was these are all statistics that were out there, just the other teams didn't really care about them. They thought that on-base percentage might be a better way, a better measure of how good a batter was. And again, we'll look at that in a bit more detail later. They also liked a statistic called slugging percentage. And again, these 2 things can be combined. So we can combine on-base percentage and slugging percentage to create a new statistic, which is shockingly called on base plus slugging. And a little bit later on, I'll show you a really complicated formula about how you can work that out from those two statistics. But, as promised, let's have a look at batting average then. So this is what the traditional scouts are using to assess hitting ability. And it's hopefully kind of a simple idea. It's basically how many times do I hit the ball out of the number of goes I have, my number of attempts, okay? So it's a percentage. It purposefully does not include those walks that we were talking about, so getting 4 no balls and walking to first base. They don't want to include that in their statistic. And other things like hit by pitch, so if the pitcher hits me, I also get to, with the ball, I also get to walk to first base. Don't include those in the statistic because they believe this does not reflect the batter's offensive skill. What Billy Beane and the Oakland Athletics did was say, we actually think those things might be useful indicators. Okay, so for example, maybe if I'm getting lots of walks, that means that I'm getting lots of no balls. Maybe that's because I'm such a good hitter, the pitcher's deliberately giving me some kind of difficult balls to hit. Okay, so maybe it does reflect how good I am as a hitter. Even if it doesn't, remember the rules of baseball. If I get on base, there's an opportunity to score. So however I get there, if you're looking at the score at the end of the day, it's that you got there that matters, not how you got there. So they think that actually a better metric might be something that takes these things into account. So get ready, spot the difference. This is the batting average. They want to include walks and hit by pitch, so they stick those on the top of the fraction. So they say that this is potentially a better metric than batting average because it's taking more scoring methods into account. But, it's not perfect. Now we've started including more things. Maybe we're counting things that actually, now they don't reflect a batter's skill. For example, if the catcher, the backstop, touches me while I'm in the batting box, I also get to walk to first base. So that one does really feel like somebody else's error and not my hitting ability. So that'd be counted in this new metric. So I'm saying this because, as we see on the next slide, this is the idea that we're going to see in this talk today. We're trying to take something like sport and distill it down into numbers and quantify it. So we're never going to achieve that. You can always do better. So by doing that improvement, we started counting other things. So we might have to think, right, how can we develop this further? How can we make a better statistic to capture batting ability? So as promised, I said I'd talk to you about slugging percentage. So it's the same idea as the batting average, but it counts the number of bases that are scored. So it's slugging, it's how far you can slug the ball. So if I get to second or third, it's giving me more credit for that than just literally getting to first base. Just hitting the ball. So then we're going to create our brand new statistic, on base plus slugging. So we take the on base percentage and we add it to the slugging percentage, and that's the OPS. So they think that actually combining these two ideas, how far you're slugging the ball, and then how much of the time are you getting on first base, might be a nice metric for your batting ability. And then we can go further. Like I say, the work is never done. So then they've since invented OPS plus or OPS adjusted. And the idea here is, so if I'm just looking at these raw numbers, maybe I play in a league where it's common to hit more home runs. Maybe the pitching's not very good in the league I play in. So if I'm just looking at the numbers, I might be fooled into thinking that this is a really good batter. So what we want to do is kind of think, how is my on-base percentage compared to the rest of the league then? Is this a superstar or is this person a bit below where we should be? So like we say, just an example of how you can keep on going, you can keep on thinking about how you can tweak these things to better measure your batting ability. Right then, so we've discussed, we've got our new metrics then, our better statistics that we think are more accurately capturing the batting ability of people. Now, we bring them in to replace those 3 top stars that we've lost. What do you think happened? Do you think they went on to win the World Series in 2002? No, they didn't. They did the same thing again. They did really, really, really well, much better than you would expect, got into the playoffs but lost. They did set a record for the most consecutive wins in a row in the season. And so, like I say, but they didn't win the final title, so Billy Beane was disappointed because it's all about getting the trophy. But I would argue that they still did a very good job. It doesn't matter that they didn't win the trophy, they still achieved something special. But it's not just me that argues that, because, like I say, there was already this movement, as Rich has talked about, towards using quantitative methods in baseball and in sport, but people noticing the Oakland Athletics doing better than they really should be doing really influenced that trajectory towards that. And as I say, it's not just generally me. So after the 2002 season, the Boston Red Sox, so again, another super famous team, offered Billy Beane $12.5 million to come and work for them. At the time, that would have been a record salary for his position. But he declined. He wanted to win with the Oakland Athletics, plus the Oakland Athletics gave him a very good package as well, so he stayed. But this is a quote from the owner of the Boston Red Sox. So he says, "Billy Beane is a sharp mind. We tried to hire him, but what we've done since," this person here, Theo Epstein, Ivy League graduate, took over. He said they couldn't get Billy Beane, so they went out and got a Harvard graduate instead. Took over is take some of the quantitative analysis approaches and overlay them with the resource advantages of our market. And in 2004, the Boston Red Sox won the World Series, ending one of the longest runs without winning a trophy for a baseball team, nearly going on 100 years. So they were a huge team, but they were never winning, and they won when they started embracing these ideas. And like we've said before, this is always what's going to happen. Your smaller market teams do something, other people see that it looks good, they copy it, and if they've got the resource, they'll do it even better. So I would say that the legacy of Moneyball really is this idea that this ubiquitous use of data and statistics, data-driven methods in baseball and other sports. So just for a final example, this is a website called jobsinfootball.com that one of my PhD students told me about. So this is where they want to work after they've done their PhD. So I typed in on jobsinfootball.com data, just searching for jobs with data. There's 480 results earlier in the week, and you can see we've got football teams in Portugal, some team I've never heard of, playing in the championship next season, are also looking for a data scientist. So that's it. A team that's in the championship are hiring data scientists these days. So on that note, that's a nice moment to hand over to Tara, who's going to talk to you about modelling things in football.
Thanks, Jess. So yeah, as Jess says, moving to statistical modelling, and we're now looking at football. So one of the reasons we're looking at football is because I love football. These are a few matches I've got to go to. Most of them are Wembley to see the Lionesses play. The bottom two you might recognise as St James's Park, also to see the Lionesses play. Big fan of the Lionesses. I think it's amazing how they're inspiring young women in football. So yeah, one of the key distributions in football modelling that's used nowadays is the Poisson distribution. Hopefully some of you recognise this from school. It definitely crops up at A-level. I can't remember if it crops up at GCSE as well. So the Poisson model can be used to find the probability of observing a certain number of things in a given interval. So we could think of this as the number of buses that arrive at a bus stop within an hour, or it could be the number of goals that are in a football match. So this is the equation that is used for the Poisson distribution. So we're thinking of the probability of seeing k objects, k events in our time interval. So if we think about it in terms of this graph over here, which is using lambda as 5, lambda is the expected number of objects within our time interval. So here it suggests that because lambda is 5, the probability of k is 5 is greater than the other probabilities, but the probability that k is 20 is very low, because that's unlikely to happen if we're expecting 5 things to occur in our interval. So we can see how the distribution changes for different values of lambda. So if we think of lambda as 2, that could be a bus stop out in the countryside. We maybe only get a bus every hour or so. So the probability of a lower number of events occurring is higher, but it drops very quickly. Even at 5 things occurring in the hour, the probability is very low. But if we say lambda is 10, so this could be a London bus stop, buses coming every 10 minutes. the probability is much more evenly spaced, and you could still be getting buses coming, the probability of buses coming, 15 buses coming in an hour. So this is just a little introduction into the Poisson distribution. So keep this in mind as it's going to come up quite a lot. So a little bit of the history of the Poisson distribution. A Frenchman, Abraham de Moivre, in around 1710, is thought to have first come up with this probability, this idea of counting things within a time interval. However, 100 years later, Simon Denis Poisson, he rediscovered this formula, but he's the one who gets the credit for it, which is why it's now known as the Poisson distribution. So this is his formula. So now we're moving into football and how this model is used in football. This is the first famous paper we're going to look at. This is by M.J. Mayer, who was working at the University of Sheffield in 1982. So he thought that, like Rich mentioned in his speech, previously football scores were modelled using the negative binomial. He thought that in a match, essentially what you need is the number of goals scored within the match. So this could be counting things on a time interval, which is our Poisson distribution. So he felt that the number of home goals could be modelled by a Poisson distribution, and then the same for the away goals. However, he thought that our parameter, which is like our expected number, it had to depend on the attacking strength of the home team, which is AI, and the defensive strength of the away team, which is DJ, in this equation here. So he felt that if you had a team, I'm going to use Liverpool as an example, because I'm a Liverpool fan. For example, we have Mo Salah playing, AI is going to be big, because he's a very good, very strong attacking player. But if you're playing someone, I'll use Dan Burns, because he ruined Liverpool's chances at the Carabao Cup this year. He's a strong defensive player. So that means the value DJ would be higher. So now we're going to move into cards in football. Cards occur very frequently in football. They crop up a lot of matches. The reason we're moving into cards is because this is my research area. There hasn't been a lot of research done into cards yet, which is why I've chosen to focus on this area. So in a match, there are two types of cards. There are yellow cards, like Jude Bellingham was getting here in the Euros last year in the match against Slovakia. And there are red cards. Red cards cause a player to be sent off straight away. Two yellow cards also cause a player to be sent off. So if your team is reduced by a player, you are essentially giving the other team an advantage. So cards do have a massive impact on the match overall. There are many, many reasons for cards to be given. Fouls, dangerous fouls could even cause a red card, straight red card. Fouls that deny goal-scoring opportunities, straight red card. Arguing with the other team, arguing with the referee, that could be a yellow card. Or unsporting behaviour, so if you take your shirt off after scoring a goal, that's excessive celebration. So that is a straight yellow card, because it's deemed to be very unsporting behaviour. So the data that I've been using is the Bundesliga data from last season. So a little bit about the Bundesliga. It's the top German football league, but unlike the Premier League, it's got 18 teams in a season. So this means there's only 306 matches. So if we total the numbers within this plot here, we'll get 306. This plot is showing the number of matches with different observed cards within the match. For example, this bottom left-hand corner here, I don't know if you can see it, but it says 7. So that means across the entire Bundesliga last year, there were only 7 matches where no cards were given to either team. So we can see that across the plot at the top, which is essentially the number of cards given to the away team, there's some sort of curve there. Similarly, for the home team, there is again some sort of curve. So we think maybe there is some sort of distribution that could be used to plot these cards. But first, we want to know a little bit about the cards in the season. So if we look at all cards last season in the Bundesliga, there were 1,267 yellow cards across the entire season. This shows that how frequently they occur. There's almost 4 times as many cards as there are matches. So definitely something that needs to be looked at. Interestingly, 588 of these cards were for the home team, 679 were for the away team. So almost 100 more of these cards were given to the away team, suggesting that could there be some sort of home advantage? Does maybe having a very large home crowd influence the referee to be more quick to give a card to the away team? Similarly, for red cards, 24 cards were given to the home team, 31 for the away team. So again, more cards, but because there are less red cards, they're given for more serious fouls. So there isn't as much data to sort of hypothesize this sort of home advantage. So Mayer had the idea of using the Poisson model. However, at the end of his paper, he suggested that maybe you could look at home and away goals together. So to do this, you would use a joint probability model. So in the same way that in this plot, we're looking at the number of cards for the home team and the number of cards for the away team, this can be used with this joint probability model, which gives us the probability that the cards for the home team is 1, and the probability that the cards for the away team is 2, for example. So the double Poisson model is essentially 2 Poisson models multiplied together. We can see that in the box below. Green could indicate the cards for the home team, X, and the blue could indicate the cards for the away team, which we could call Y. Because we now have 2 separate Poisson models, we want 2 different parameters. So I've decided, in my research, that I think that the lambda should be the average number of cards for the home team, mu should be the average number of cards for the away team. I've kept it general across the league. I haven't looked at teams like Mayer has suggested, but this does sort of follow his idea of goals. So you could swap cards with goals and also look at goals with this model. So if you plug this formula into the Bundesliga data from last season, we get that the average number of cards given to the home team is 2, and the average number of cards given to the away team is 2.32. So we can see that it's slightly higher for the away team, but it's not much. So maybe there is a home advantage, but it's not obvious. So in this plot, we can see that the most likely outcomes are either 2 cards for each team, or 1 card for the home team, 2 cards for the away team. So we can see our Poisson distributions along the top and the side. The top one is the away team Poisson. So we can see that 2 is clearly more likely than any other outcome. But for the home team, where our average is 2, 2 and 1 are equally likely outcomes when we're looking at just the home team separately. But we can also see that greater number of cards in matches, such as 7 cards to each team, this is a very unlikely outcome. So it'd be interesting to see how this works with the data. The next famous paper that we're using, and this is probably the most famous paper in football analysis that exists today, was by Mark Dixon and Stuart Coles at the University of Lancaster in 1997. So they were also modelling association football scores. However, they wanted to create probabilities that could match bookmakers' odds. Hence the second part of their title, Inefficiencies in the Football Betting Market. They wanted to improve Mayer's model, see if they could make it even more accurate. So again, they used the idea of this double Poisson model with the joint probability, which gives us this sort of heat map, this square heat map. However, their data that they were using was English football data in the early 90s, so not just league data, but cup data. So for example, you could have teams from different leagues playing each other. So again, they wanted to include this team parameter like Mayer did in this home attack and away defence idea, as this would influence parameters. But something that they noticed when they were looking into the data was that some outcomes were much more likely. These outcomes were 0-0, 1-1, 1-0 and 0-1. So almost this top corner on this plot here. So they wanted to increase the probabilities of this corner to match the data that they saw. So this gave us the Dixon-Coles model. So again, we've got our double Poisson model. However, it's multiplied by this inflation factor, which is denoted by tau. And this tau only affects 4 possible outcomes. So it was our top corner in that plot. It's 0-0, 0-1, 1-0, 1-all. But the interesting thing about tau is that it includes this dependence parameter, which we call rho, which is in purple on the equation at the bottom. And this links the cards between the home and away teams, as they felt that there was some connection between goals scored between 2 teams. Remember, they created this model for goals. I've put cards there because that's how I am using the model. But they felt that in a match, a team may be more likely to take risks. If they were losing with 10 minutes to go, they might take defensive risks, and so they would play more aggressively, attack more, but just maybe leave a few holes in their defence. So they also wondered whether maybe parameters could change throughout the match. However, this was just an idea that they mentioned in the paper, and we're just going to look at this general model, which is match-to-match data. So when we apply Dixon-Coles, we're going back to cards in the Bundesliga now. We've got our lambda and mu that we've already calculated, and then we calculate rho to be 0.0176. So it's quite a small value, but we essentially have our double Poisson plot, but the only difference is our bottom square, because this is how tau is influenced. We can see that it suggests that very few matches will have no cards in the Bundesliga. So we'll have to compare these models to the actual data to really see if they are accurate. And to do that, I created heat maps of the difference. So for each plot, it's the number of observed matches in the Bundesliga last year minus the number of expected matches given by each model. We could kind of see from a brief look that they follow similar patterns. The only difference is the bottom corner, as that is the only difference between the 2 models, this parameter tau. Inflation factor, tau. So we can see that white squares indicate that the difference is very close to 0, so that the models have accurately predicted these squares, is the idea. Blue squares are where the observed data is much greater than the expected values. And red squares indicate where the observed data is much smaller than the expected values. So for the Dixon-Coles model, the difference between the double Poisson and Dixon-Coles is that it has improved the predictions for 1 card to the home team, no cards to the away team, and for 1 card to the away team, no cards to the home team, as these squares are both lighter. They're closer to 0. However, it's drastically increased the difference between 1 card to each team or no cards to each team, as these squares are very blue. And in fact, it's because it's suggested that the likelihood of no cards to each team is so close to 0, which doesn't match our data, which suggests there are 7 matches last year that had no cards given to each team. This square has increased the scale in the Dixon-Coles model. So if we compare, for example, the 2 cards to the away team, 1 card to the home team, which is minus 3.9 for both plots, because it's outside the tau inflation factor for the Dixon-Coles model, it's actually lighter red on the Dixon-Coles difference than it is on the double Poisson difference, purely because this 1 square has increased the scale of the difference for the entire plot. So we can sort of see that maybe neither of these models are 100% accurate enough to actually predict cards in football. So more work is needed, which is lucky for me, because I get to do this work. So I've got a foundation for my next steps, so hopefully I'll find a model eventually that does predict cards in football. But a little bit more about Mark Dixon and Stuart Coles. As I said, one of their aims in their paper was to improve bookmakers' odds. And they felt that they could financially benefit from the research they'd done. And so Mark Dixon went to set up ATASS Sports. They work with teams, they work with bookmakers, they work with wealthy bettors, and And a lot of the research they do, and the work they do, is based on this Dixon-Coles model from 1997. Stuart Coles went on to work at SmartOdds. They also work with teams, and they work with companies to do sort of risk analysis around sports. An example of this is they worked with Papa John's last year in the Euros. Papa John's had a discount which I believe was 10% off if England won the match. So they would have worked with SmartOdds to ensure that they weren't losing out if England did win. They could still have this realistic discount that would incentivize people to hopefully buy more pizza, but they could still make a profit. So it's very interesting work that they've done. The Dixon-Coles model has also gone on to influence massive companies like StatsPerform, which some of you may have heard of, but they create these larger, more complicated models to look at all sorts of aspects of sport, not just goals. They look at shots, expected goals within a match, things like that. But every single one of their models, the most common component is this Poisson component, thought of by Mayer and then expanded on by Dixon and Coles. So thinking about the more aspects of sport and of football, we're going to pass you over to India.
Thank you, Tara. So I'm just going to go through some of my work, which is looking at bigger models. And the reason for that is because, well, we've looked at how you might go about modelling goals and how this can be adapted to model cards. There's so many more elements in a game of football. You've got throw-ins, corners, free kicks, possession, to name a few. And so my question was, do these things happen independently? Because I would argue that they don't. So if you take a foul, this can lead to a yellow card or a red card. Then depending on where it happens on a pitch, it can lead to a penalty or free kick, which could lead to a goal kick, a corner, a throw-in, another foul, right? And all of this stemming from the first foul. So I would argue these things don't happen independently. So if we limit our attention to just 6 of the variables, being goals, shots, and yellow cards, separated for the home and away team, we can examine the correlations between them. What we find, in the areas in blue are some negative correlation, the areas in red some positive correlation, and what we find that across the 15 different pairs of correlations, only 2 don't come out to be significant following a t-test at the 5% level. So this suggested to me that a model that tries to model all of these variables together simultaneously could be really useful. But how do we do that? Well, one option is to use something known as a copula. A copula is a multivariate distribution that enables us to create joint distributions between multiple variables while capturing any dependent structure that they exhibit. And the sort of main theorem that underpins most of copula theory is known as Scalar's theorem, which states that if you have an n-dimensional distribution H, this can be represented by a copula applied to your variable's uniform marginals. By uniform marginals, I just mean that your values have been mapped to values between 0 and 1, and this is typically done by using the cumulative distribution function, which gives you the probability of an event happening cumulatively, so it's always a number between 0 and 1. But the biggest issue with most copulas is they're mostly suited to the bivariate case, just between 2 variables. And this is because most copulas are governed by 1 or 2 what's known as dependence parameters. And if we look again at our correlations, we've got too many. Some are too really weak, some are really strong, some are positive, some are negative, and 1 or 2 parameters isn't really going to cut it when it comes to capturing all these relationships. So we turn to something known as a Vine copula. And Vine copulas allow us to decompose a multivariate copula into a sequence, or vine, of bivariate copula. And these describe just relationships between pairs of variables rather than trying to describe all the variables all at once. First step in doing this is to notice that if you want the probability of m different variables, this can be decomposed into a sequence of conditional probabilities instead, right? this is step 1 of like 7. So I'm not going to go through them all because we'll be here all day. But this sort of sets the stage. Vine copulars, though, aren't viewed as an equation as you would with everything else. Instead, they're typically viewed by a sequence of trees. And so in our vine, between 6 variables, we end up with 5 trees. And each tree is made up of nodes and edges. So if we look at tree 0, that edge at the top between away yellows and home yellows, this is where a bivariate copula is assigned. And that bivariate copula describes the relationship between away yellows and home yellows. As we go down the trees, for example, if we go to tree 2, we now have an edge between away yellows and away shots, but this time it's conditioned on home shots and home yellows. So as you go down the trees, we end up including conditioning, but we're still only ever describing a relationship between 2 variables. As I said, we had 15 pairs of correlations, we have 15 edges, so we have 15 bivariate copula that describes all of the relationships. So overall, they're just powerful tools. They enable us to capture really complex relationships in ways that correlation metrics such as Pearson's or Kendall's can't really do. We can jointly model loads of different variables regardless of what distribution they come from. So for example, if I wanted to include possession, this would be a normal random variable, whereas shots, goals, cards are discrete, which are count variables. We wouldn't be able to couple them together with anything else. And the way that I use them a lot is that you can really easily simulate new data points. So once I've got my vine copula, I can then simulate from it, and from that I could pull out probabilities, odds, really examine the relationships and stuff like that. So thank you very much for your attention. That brings us to the end of our talk.
Okay, so I think we've just got time for 1 or 2 questions from the audience at the end, if you've got any. So if you stick your hand up, my fantastic assistant over there will come and find you with a microphone. Oh, brilliant. Perfect. Perfect number, 2 hands.
Thanks very much. Well, sport's not really my thing, but the last lecture was really interesting, you know. But anyway, no, it's about football. You can actually have a team dominating the match for 90%, but the other team, that's rubbish, scores a goal. It can happen. Yeah, that's just the point, that's all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Rich?
I was just going to say, as a fan of Notts County, who do that all the time, I would say that's an interesting effect that shows how the football changes over time, and it's the sort of models that possibly going to need to be trained on certain seasons. That seems to be a trend that's happening more and more in modern football, dominating possession and then losing the game. So we're going to need to ensure that we use more recent data to build those copula type models.
City did that a lot as well. You know, they captured it. They're not a very good team, but they beat Man United, didn't they?
Where it's really common now to do this as a game. This Reap's ideas are coming back, basically.
Yeah, I think it's what we're seeing. I suppose the wheel turns and the same spoke comes round again, but it is that idea that people are thinking maybe Man City, possession, that's a good way to play, so everyone starts doing it, so then you have to be the innovator and think, how could we win against it? Yeah, great point, thank you. Oh, the hands are multiplying, excellent.
Given Brentford Football Club's success and their data-driven methods of recruitment, would it make any sense whatsoever for Thomas Frank to leave Brentford to go to Spurs, who have a notoriously useless recruitment process?
So, yeah. So, Tara alluded to this a little bit. We showed the Dixon Coles model. So the smart odds, they have something to do with Brentford. So there's some teams, Brentford, Brighton, they're known to have very strong analytics departments, and it's the same. It was the same with Moneyball. It's the same now. There's a movement towards it, but some people are embracing it more than others. So yeah, maybe Tottenham are a bit slower. We'll get there in the end. Okay. I'm going to get in trouble with the Festival of Ideas people. Go on then. Yeah, I think that's time. There's one at the back and then one at here. Oh, there you are. I see. Yeah.
I wondered just...
Sorry. There's one, and then I'll come to you next. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Just wonder what other sports you look at apart from football and baseball.
Oh, thank you. Great question. Rich?
So we do all kinds. So Jess has done some fantastic work on heptathlon as well, but I've done some research on basketball because I'm not a fan and I'd like to prove why we shouldn't. But so there's so much data now. Tennis is another one we're looking at in the future. So much data generated now that's often open for people to look at. It's really great that we can do more and more analysis on different kinds of sports.
Yeah, so traditionally as we've been talking about, the money's in football. So the resource, the data's in football. So that's where a lot of this starts. But as Tara was saying, we're trying to, and that's one of the things with QSA, we really want quantitative sports analysis for all. So we're trying to widen it out as much as we can. But yeah, it's about collecting the data. We could talk about this. Basically, when Rich is saying that, so QSA is just me and Rich having arguments about sport and then trying to go away and prove ourselves right with statistics. So that's the project he's talking about. Okay, one last question in the blue jumper. Wait a minute, I think they need the... Come on, I'll do it.
Hi, Jess. You mentioned about slugging and hitting and things like that. What about pitching and catching and running and things like that? Did that analysis get done?
Oh, fantastic question. I promise I didn't ask this person to ask this question. So Billy Bean isn't sort of the architect of these statistics. He was just a person, like we're saying, with Tottenham, who noticed someone called Bill James. Look this guy up, he's my hero. Who was just a person working, I think, in a label factory, something like this, and collecting, like we said before, collecting his own statistics in baseball because they weren't out there. So Billy Bean was noticing the work of Bill James, and he first went to batting because he felt that was where he could find the insights. And again, he was a bit like me and Rich. He was just writing these baseball abstracts that was just his kind of rants about how wrong baseball's getting it. So he did that first, and then yes, absolutely, it's slightly harder to do fielding, and the statistics weren't there at the time when this work started being done, but it's definitely being done now. There's so much work being done now, watching pitchers throwing the ball with, movement sensing sort of cameras and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely expanded, but the very first was the batting stuff, because that's the offence, is the fun thing. Right, I can see we're getting in trouble, so I'll end it there. So can we thank the speakers one more time? Thank you for attending the session, and make sure you check out, there's lots of things going on. In fact, the very next slot after us I'm staying for, there's another talk about football, so lots going on in the festival. Make sure you see what's going on. Thank you.